The chair scraped against the polished floor. Sharp, clean, loud enough to cut through the low hum of translation systems and the soft atmospheric filters that kept the air breathable for 11 different species at once. Every alien in the chamber turned to look at me. I didn't look back. For a fraction of a second, the entire room held still in a way that had nothing to do with silence and everything to do with recognition. It was the kind of stillness that happens when a pattern breaks. When something expected simply doesn't happen. Then I spoke. 2 sentences. That was all. The talks are no longer productive. My voice moved through the chamber without emphasis, without elevation, translated into 11 languages before the final syllable left my mouth. We are leaving. And behind me, without signal, without instruction, without a single word exchanged, 41 members of the human delegation rose from their seats. Not all at once. Not theatrically. Sequentially. Naturally. The way people move when they've arrived at the same conclusion. I turned and walked toward the exit. The sound of my footsteps was the only sound in the chamber. For 3 steps. Then there were more. Measured. Unhurried. Certain. And in that moment, the Galactic Council, the most powerful governing body in the known systems, 40 years of structured diplomacy, 11 civilizations, thousands of decisions, had no protocol for what it was watching. Because nothing like this had ever happened before. My name is Elias Varon. I was Earth's chief delegate to the Galactic Council for 3 years, for months, and 9 days. And every single one of those days had been preparation for that walk. Let me take you back. My first session in the chamber lasted 6 hours. I had prepared for weeks. The proposal was clean, Earth's formal request for integration into the Council's trade network. It was precise, well-supported, and aligned with every framework the Council had established. I had read their precedents. I had studied their language. I had structured the argument the way they structured their own decisions. I spoke. Clearly. Completely. The response took less than a minute. A request for clarification from the virile delegation. A procedural concern from the Ketheri. A gentle suggestion from the breath, always the breath, that the matter would benefit from further review in subcommittee. It was assigned. Deferred. Filed. The proposal was never mentioned again. That was the moment something shifted in me. Not into anger. Not into frustration. Into attention. I started watching differently after that. The chamber itself was designed to impress, and it succeeded. A vast circular hall, tiered seating rising in smooth arcs around a central platform. Above it, a slow-rotating holographic projection of the known systems hung in the air, every point of light representing a civilization, a trade route, a resource node, a negotiation, or a boundary. The lighting was calibrated for 12 different visual spectrums. The air composition shifted subtly depending on which species was speaking most frequently. Everything about that room said the same thing. This is where order is maintained. This is where decisions are made. This is where you come to be heard. It took me less than 6 months to understand that the last part was not entirely true. I had spoken in that chamber 211 times by the end of my tenure. The Council kept records of everything. Every statement, every proposal, every objection, every vote. Nothing was lost. Nothing was forgotten. It was all perfectly preserved. And almost none of it moved. I began timing things that first year, out of a specific kind of curiosity. I wanted to know how long it took, on average, for a human proposal to reach formal dismissal. 17 seconds. I timed it repeatedly to be sure. The method varied, sometimes a procedural question, sometimes a deferral, sometimes a request that arrived with such polished neutrality that it almost felt like engagement. But the outcome was consistent. 17 seconds. I stopped timing things after a while. Not because the numbers stopped matching, because I had already learned what they were there to teach me. The Council did not run on correctness. It ran on expectations. And humanity, from the moment we arrived in that chamber, had been assigned a very specific set of them. Young, capable, eager, manageable. We were the species that would adapt, the species that would learn, the species that would eventually understand how things were done, and then, having understood, would fall into line behind the civilizations that had come before us. That was the role they had written for us before we ever walked through the door. I remember the exact session when I understood it completely, not as a theory, as a fact. A Ketheri delegate had asked about our energy output projections, not our proposal, which was sitting in its 3rd month of subcommittee review, but our projections. A technical question. Routine, on the surface. I answered it. Accurately. Completely. That answer was discussed for 47 minutes. Our proposal was not mentioned once. I sat through those 47 minutes with my hands folded on the console and my expression composed, and I felt something settle inside me like cold water. They weren't interested in our progress. They were interested in our data. There is a difference. A vast one. Progress implied agency. Progress implied a destination we were steering toward on our own terms. Data was something you extracted from a resource. I had allowed them to believe we were manageable, not because it was true, because it was useful. By the end of my first year, I had adjusted my approach. Not visibly, not in any way that would register on the surface. Outwardly, I remained exactly what they expected, measured, cooperative, engaged. I spoke when recognized. I followed procedure. I submitted documents in the correct format, through the correct channels, with the correct supporting data. Everything about my presence reinforced their initial assessment. But what changed was not what I showed them. It was what I stopped assuming. I stopped assuming that progress inside the room meant progress overall. I stopped assuming that agreement in principle would become action in practice. I stopped assuming that the council's timeline had anything to do with ours. Instead, I started paying attention to something far more revealing. What the council did not ask. They asked about our trade outputs. They did not ask how those outputs were scaling year over year beyond the submitted summaries. They asked about our fleet numbers. They did not ask about construction capacity. They asked about our infrastructure. They did not ask about redundancy. At first, it seemed like oversight. Reasonable, even. The council managed 11 civilizations simultaneously. Information prioritization made sense. Then it became clear. It wasn't that they were missing information. It was that they had already decided what information mattered. Everything else fell outside that frame. And if it fell outside that frame, it wasn't pursued, not because it was hidden, but because it was not considered relevant. That was when the real work began. Quietly, systematically, not in opposition to the council, alongside it. Every agreement we signed was filed correctly. Every project we initiated was registered. Every data point we generated was submitted where it was required to be submitted. Nothing was concealed. Nothing was falsified. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be, just not where they were looking. The morning everything changed had started like every other session. Sovereign Threx of the Breath had been speaking for some time when I arrived. He spoke in the measured, inevitable cadence his people favored, the tone of someone who has already decided the outcome and is now simply narrating it into existence. He did not raise his voice. He never needed to. The weight of the words did the work for him. The document in front of me was 32 pages. Voluntary disarmament. Supervised integration. Collective security compliance. Each phrase had been polished until it gleamed with reasonableness. If you listened only to the language, it sounded cooperative. Almost generous. That was the design. I had heard variations of this over the past 3 years. Never this complete. Never this final. It had been building. Incrementally, the way these things always built. A clause here. A recommendation there. Adjustments framed as efficiency improvements. Safeguards framed as mutual protection. Each one small enough to accept without immediate consequence. Each one positioned as a natural step toward stability within a system that was, the council always implied, already working. Individually, none of those clauses had been unacceptable. Together, they formed something else entirely. A structure. A framework. One that placed humanity exactly where the council had always expected us to end up. Inside the system, managed by it, limited by it. Permanently. That morning, Sovereign Threx had presented the completed version. No more gradual steps. No more incremental adjustments. Just the finished shape. He had not looked at me while he read it. That was not an oversight. It was a signal. The kind that says the outcome does not depend on your reaction. The kind that assumes compliance has already been decided. Around him, the chamber had remained perfectly still. No interruptions. No procedural objections. No requests for clarification. The other delegates had already seen the document. Already reviewed it. Already aligned. By the time something reached the floor in that form, it was no longer a proposal. It was a conclusion waiting to be recorded. The translation had finished running through my earpiece 2 seconds after he stopped speaking. I took those 2 seconds. Not to think. The decision had been made long before that moment. I took them to observe. To confirm. No dissent. No hesitation. No one asking the question that should have been the first one asked. What happens if they refuse? Because refusal was not part of their model. Not in a way that mattered. They had watched us for 3 years. They had seen us adapt, negotiate, engage, respond. They had categorized us. And categories, once assigned, tend to hold. I turned one page of the document, then another. Not because I needed to read it. I had read it before the session began. I did it because I wanted them to see me read it. To register engagement, consideration, all the signals they expected. I reached the final page. Sovereign Threx had already set his copy aside. Hands folded, expression unchanged, waiting with the particular confidence of someone who has never genuinely considered an alternative outcome. Humans adapted. Humans negotiated. Humans accepted the framework. Why would this be different? I let the document rest on the console in front of me, and then I looked up at him. For the first time since he had begun speaking, his gaze met mine. There was something there. Not emotion, something more controlled than emotion. An adjustment. A recognition that a variable had entered the room that didn't fit the model. That was when I knew the moment had arrived. Not because of what he had said, because of how the room had received it. No resistance. No variation. A system functioning exactly as designed. And in doing so, revealing its limits. I placed my hand on the edge of the console. Felt the smooth surface under my fingers. The same position I had taken hundreds of times before. Same posture. Same stillness. From the outside, nothing had changed. From the inside, everything had. Behind me, I could feel the weight of the delegation. Not as pressure, as alignment. They had read the document. They had understood it. They had reached the same conclusion. Not a discussion. Not a debate. A decision. Sovereign Threx inclined his head. An invitation to speak. To engage. To enter the process. I held his gaze for one long moment. Then I pushed my chair back. The sound it made was not loud, but it was sharp, clean, unmistakable in a room built for controlled acoustics. It cut through the hum of translation systems and the layered silence of controlled diplomacy, and it landed in that chamber like a stone dropped into still water. For a fraction of a second, nothing moved. Then everything did, not outwardly, not dramatically, but in the way attention shifts when something stops following the script. I stood, reached down, picked up my data pad. A routine motion, one I had performed hundreds of times, except that I had never done it at this precise point in a session before. And in a system built on the recognition of patterns, even a small deviation is visible. Behind me, the first chair moved, then another, then more. Not simultaneously, not as rehearsed choreography, sequentially, naturally. 41 people arriving at the same conclusion at the same moment, each of them making an individual choice, and all of those choices landing in the same direction. No words exchanged. None needed. That was something the council had never understood about us. They believed coordination required instruction. They believed alignment required hierarchy. They believed unity had to be enforced from above or it would fracture below. They had never seen what it looked like when it came from inside. Across the chamber, the shift registered. Not in sound. In stillness. The kind of stillness that isn't calm. It's the held breath before the mind catches up with what the eyes are already seeing. Sovereign Threx remained seated. Of course he did. To stand would have been to acknowledge uncertainty. Remaining seated preserved the appearance of control. His gaze was fixed on me now, no longer neutral, no longer processing at the rate of routine evaluation. He was measuring, searching for the variable he had missed. He would not find it. Not in time. The talks are no longer productive. No force. No rise in tone. No emotion for the translation system to flag and route and categorize. Just clarity. The translation nodes in the chamber lagged by half a second. Not because they couldn't process the sentence, because they were recalibrating context. Productive implied continuation. Implied a shared goal. Implied a process that could be measured and improved. I had just removed all of that. We are leaving. No qualifier. No condition. No invitation for response. Silence followed. Not the silence of shock. The silence of a system encountering something it does not have a category for. I reached down, picked up my data pad, and turned. No pause for procedural response. No deference to the structure of the room. Just movement. Forward. My footsteps fell against the polished floor. 1, 2, 3. And for those first few steps, the sound was singular. Then came the second set. Closer. Then more. until the sound resolved into a single, unified rhythm. Measured, unhurried, certain. 42 human delegates walking out of the Galactic Council chamber. Not rushed, not defiant, not performing anything. Simply done. Behind us, the chamber fractured. Not into chaos. That would have been easier to process. Into confusion, the specific, disorienting confusion of a system that has lost a participant it had classified as secured. Voices rose, not loud but layered, different languages overlapping as translation systems struggled to keep pace with simultaneous input. Ambassador. Procedural violation. This session is still. Clarification required. No one finished a sentence. No one established control. Because control required a structure that was no longer being followed. An automated signal tone attempted to activate, the system designed to restore order during disruptions. It cut off halfway through its sequence. Even the machine wasn't sure what protocol applied. I did not slow, did not turn, did not acknowledge any of it. The doors ahead were tall, seamless, built from layered unity glass embedded with the mineral signatures of every founding species. Symbolism made physical. Transparency, unity, permanence. From the right angle, in the right light, you could see the faint colors of 11 worlds layered within the panels. A reminder, a statement, a claim. I reached the release panel, pressed it. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened, just long enough for the thought to form that perhaps they had thought of this, perhaps they had built something to stop exactly this moment. Then the doors parted, effortlessly. Of course they did. The council believed in openness, in the idea that anyone could leave at any time. They had simply never expected anyone to do it like this. I stepped through. The corridor beyond was quiet, neutral, a transitional space between significance and movement. Behind me, the delegation followed, one after another. Same pace, same direction, no hesitation. The last of us passed through. The doors closed. The sound they made was soft, contained, final. And for the first time in 3 years, for months and 9 days, I was no longer inside that chamber. I kept walking. The council's response, once it came, was exactly what I had expected. Not because I was cynical about them, because I had spent 3 years learning how they moved. Their first instinct was procedural, always procedural. The system that had functioned for 4 decades without significant disruption defaulted to continuation, because continuation was the only mode it had ever needed. What I had not anticipated was how long it would take them to realize the system had nothing left to continue. Sovereign Threx remained seated for 9 full seconds after the doors closed. I learned this later from independent sources. 9 seconds of stillness, long enough to preserve the appearance of control, not long enough to actually exercise it. His first action was to request confirmation of session status from the administrative node. The system responded as it always did. Session active. No formal recess declared. That was technically correct. Nothing in the council's framework accounted for a full delegation leaving without initiating protocol. There was no classification for it. No predefined response. No assigned pathway. Which meant the system defaulted to the only thing it knew. Continuation. A continuation that no longer had participants. The first formal query reached our delegation channel 43 seconds after we left. Polite. Neutral. Requesting confirmation of status. It was transmitted with the measured tone of an institution that was not yet sure whether it was dealing with an error or an event. It received no response. A second message followed 2 minutes later, slightly more direct, referencing session continuity, requesting immediate clarification. No response. A third at 12 minutes. No longer neutral. No longer procedural. Confirm delegation status immediately. No response. Inside the chamber, things had begun to unravel, quietly at first, then less quietly. Delegates accessed records, pulled session data, reviewed communication logs, looking for context, for precedent, for anything that would allow them to file what had just happened into a category that already existed. They found nothing, because nothing like this had happened before. The first real fracture came when a Salari observer in the upper gallery, the Salari, who did not act without purpose, who did not escalate without certainty, transmitted a secured report to their home system. High priority. Restricted classification. The council saw the authentication flags, logged them, noted them, and felt, for the first time, something that was not confusion, something closer to alarm. Because the Salari did not send messages like that to describe uncertainty. They sent them to describe recognition. Sovereign Threx stood at 26 minutes. Not abruptly, not with visible urgency, but he stood, and those who knew his species understood immediately what that meant. He did not stand unless necessary. And necessity, in that chamber, was rare. He requested a status update on human fleet disposition, not through the Council database. Through a secondary channel. Military. Private. That single request changed the temperature of the room, because it implied a question that had never been asked before. Not in that chamber, not in that way. What are they doing? Not in the chamber. Outside it. At 31 minutes, the Council initiated an emergency subsession, the first in 40 years. The protocol activated automatically once certain thresholds were met. Multiple unresolved variables, high-priority external communications, unclassified procedural disruption. All conditions satisfied. The chamber sealed. All available data streams redirected to central analysis. That was the moment concern became alarm. Not because of what had happened, because of what it implied. And then the data started coming in. Human trade reports. Infrastructure registrations. Energy output summaries. All accurate. All complete. And all, it turned out, deeply underestimated. A breath analyst brought up the Kepler secondary belt first. Resource extraction rates across the previous 8 years. The graph appeared in the air above the central console, a clean ascending curve, steady, controlled, within acceptable variance. Then someone overlaid the secondary line, previously filtered out of standard reports. It showed actual throughput, not summarized, not averaged, raw. The gap between expected and actual extraction output was not dramatic in any single year, but it was consistent, and it compounded, year after year, cycle after cycle, until the cumulative difference represented not a minor discrepancy, but a systematic pattern, one that, cross-referenced against export destinations, revealed a network of trade routes that had been sitting in the Council's own filings, correctly submitted, properly authenticated, and completely overlooked. Because no one had ever asked for them in a single query before. The Hanari Collective appeared at the center of that cluster. Council classification, strategically marginal. Previous assessed trade volume, minimal. The detailed logs told a different story. Sustained material transfers across multiple cycles. Infrastructure components. Energy systems. Advanced fabrication units. All filed. All approved. All unnoticed. A Kethari delegate leaned forward. Those figures are inconsistent with Council registry summaries. They are drawn from Council registry filings, the analyst replied. Authenticated. Time-stamped. Verified. The silence that followed was not confusion. It was recognition. Because the data was not wrong. It was simply complete. Another layer surfaced. Construction authorizations. Deep space relay stations, 3 of them, completed within 18 months. Location, beyond standard Council patrol routes. Specifications, not present in any shared technical database. A pattern match ran against known engineering frameworks. Match found. Human design architecture. Not experimental. Not theoretical. Operational. A murmur moved through the chamber. Low. Controlled. But no longer dismissive. Fleet reports came next. Human military capacity. The Council had requested those numbers regularly, and we had provided them exactly as requested. Active frontline vessels, commissioned, registered, visible, accurate, complete, and incomplete. When someone finally thought to request reserve development data, the system paused for a moment before responding, searching for information that had never been consolidated because no one had ever asked for it in a single query. When it assembled, the chamber went completely still, not because of the numbers themselves, because of what they represented. Parallel development. Construction programs running outside standard reporting focus. Joint fabrication agreements with non-council partners. Capacity that did not appear in any single document, but existed across all of them. Hidden in plain sight. Not concealed. Just unconnected. They did not misreport, the Kethari delegate said slowly. They reported exactly what was requested. And nothing more, another voice added. That was when the understanding shifted from data to intent. This was not oversight. This was design. A deliberate alignment with the Council's own processes. Answer the question asked, follow the data required, follow every rule, and build everything else in the spaces those rules did not cover. Sovereign Threx, closed the data stream. His voice, when it came, was quiet, even, but it landed with more weight than anything else said since the emergency session began. They were never behind. A pause. They were building, not as a reaction, not as a contingency, not even as a response to the proposal that morning, as a parallel track, independent, sustained, purposeful. The communication network map filled the chamber next, node after node, 12 primary relays operating at full capacity, extending beyond council-controlled space. Bandwidth exceeding standard allocations. Latency reduced across multiple sectors. A system not dependent on council infrastructure. A system that required no permission. Trade, infrastructure, fleet, communication. Each one, on its own, manageable. Together, they form something else. A foundation. A system that did not replace the council, but did not rely on it either. They are not coming back to continue discussions, one delegate said. Sovereign Threx's gaze remained steady. No, he said. They will return. A pause. Measured. Precise. But not to this. And for the first time since the council had been formed, the realization settled fully into place. Humanity had not left to gain leverage. They had left because they no longer needed it. We gave them 48 hours. Not because we needed that time. Because they did. The message was delivered through a secured channel, routed directly to the council's administrative core and mirrored simultaneously to all 11 primary delegations. No delay. No hierarchy. No filtering. A formal invitation to resume talks. Location, Earth. Host authority, human delegation. Agenda, attached. Acceptance of framework, required prior to attendance. No modifications permitted before session. The wording was deliberate. Not aggressive. Not confrontational. Absolute. The council received it 9 hours after the emergency subsession began. They read it in silence. Because by then, they understood enough to recognize what it was. Not a request. Not a negotiation opening. A condition. Participation required alignment. Not the other way around. Sovereign Threx read the document twice. The first time for content. The second time for structure. Because structure reveals intent. And the intent here was unmistakable. The framework of the meeting had already been decided. Time limits. Speaking order. Decision pathways. Resolution thresholds. Everything the council usually controlled, predefined. By us. The most important clause sat at the end. Agenda items accepted as governing framework prior to session initiation. No procedural delays. No subcommittee deferrals. No iterative dilution. Either they agreed to engage under those conditions, or there would be no session. Across the chamber, reactions varied. A virile delegate objected to the lack of procedural flexibility. A Kethari analyst questioned legality. A breath aide began outlining potential counterterms. Sovereign Threx did none of those things. He closed the document, placed it on the console, and said nothing for several seconds. Because he understood something the others were still trying to argue against. The council's authority existed within its system. This was outside it. And the moment we had walked out, we had made that distinction real. Can we compel participation under revised terms? One delegate asked. No one answered immediately, because the answer was obvious. No. Compulsion requires leverage. Leverage requires dependency. And the data they had spent the last several hours analyzing had already removed that assumption entirely. The first external response came from this theory, not through the council, directly. A private communication routed to our channel. Authenticated. Senior clearance. Request direct discussion regarding proposed framework. No objections. No conditions. Just engagement. Sovereign Threx read that message, and, for the first time since the morning, something registered on his face. Minimal. Controlled. But visible. Because this theory did not move independently unless they had already decided the direction of change. They are aligning early, a breath aide said. Yes, Threx replied. Because they have been paying attention. Within the next 6 hours, 2 more delegations requested clarification on the proposed framework. Not objections. Clarification. That was the signal. Resistance was no longer the dominant response. Evaluation was. We had removed time from the equation. 48 hours for preparation, not negotiation. The difference mattered. Because preparation implies acceptance. Negotiation implies resistance. By defining the timeline that way, we had already shifted the starting position. Sovereign Threx stood. Not abruptly. Not with urgency, with decision. He requested a private channel to his home government. Secured. The connection established within seconds. He spoke for 14 minutes. When the channel closed, his posture had changed. Not dramatically, subtly, the way it does when a calculation resolves. He returned to the central console and addressed the chamber. The breath hegemony will attend. No qualifiers. No conditions. It landed harder than any objection could have, because it removed the possibility of unified resistance. If the breath attended, the others had to consider it. If the others considered it, the framework held. A Kethari delegate began to speak, something about procedural integrity, about the risks of abandoning established systems. Threx did not interrupt. He let him finish. Then he responded. Established systems require participation to function. A pause. Measured. Deliberate. They have withdrawn theirs. Silence followed. Not disagreement. Not confusion. Acceptance. By the 36th hour, confirmations began to arrive. One by one. Stheri. Viral. Kethari. Each message structured differently, framed in its own diplomatic language, but carrying the same meaning. They would attend. Under the proposed framework. By the 44th hour, all 11 had confirmed. Not because they agreed with every term, but because the alternative, irrelevance, was the only outcome they could not accept. And so, for the first time in 40 years, they prepared to sit at a table they did not control. 6 months later, the difference was no longer theoretical. It was visible, not in declarations or formal records, but in the small, ordinary movements that make up a functioning system. I stood at the observation viewport overlooking the primary traffic lanes of Vareth Station. Below, ships moved through the approach pattern in steady arcs, guided by the updated coordination system. A Hanari freighter held its position at the entry boundary. A breath supply vessel adjusted its trajectory, not because it was instructed to yield, because the protocol assigned right-of-way to the Hanari vessel, and the protocol applied equally. 6 months ago, the Hanari would have waited, not by any written rule, by expectation, by the invisible weight of decades of hierarchy that had never needed to be stated because it had never been challenged. Now they didn't wait. They followed the system, and the system recognized them. The freighter moved forward. Clean. Uninterrupted. The breath vessel shifted its course by a precise margin, maintaining spacing, maintaining flow. No protest. No override. Just compliance. Routine. Unremarkable. That was how you knew the change had taken hold. Not when it was argued. When it became ordinary. The relay network had been the first system fully transitioned. 12 nodes expanded to 14, bandwidth allocation standardized, access protocols unified. Communication delays had been one of the Council's quiet controls. Distance created dependence. Dependence created structure. We had removed distance. A message sent from a peripheral system now reached the core in a fraction of the previous time. Not routed. Not filtered. Direct. That changed how decisions were made, because information arrived before it could be shaped. The technology transfer documentation had gone public 3 months prior. The response had not been what many expected. No widespread collapse. No systemic breakdown. Just acceleration. Research programs stalled for decades resumed within weeks. Collaborations formed across species lines that had never previously intersected. The Hanari were the first to produce a result, a modification to standard drive configuration. Incremental, but real. And shared. Openly. Reviewed by 3 independent groups within the first month. Expanded upon within the second. Progress was no longer centralized. It distributed itself. Naturally. Because the barriers that had once directed it were gone. The resource distribution audit had come back that morning. Allocation variance between council and non-council species had dropped from 22% 6 months ago to below 3%. That was not a rounding error. That was a shift. Sovereign Threx stepped beside me at the viewport. His presence was marked more by stillness than movement. The particular stillness of someone who has learned to exist in a world that looks different than the one they were trained for. The latest audit confirms network stability across all nodes, he said. His voice carried the same measured tone it always had. Careful. Precise. I've seen it, I said. A 41% reduction in cross-sector communication delay. Yes. He watched the traffic pattern for a moment. The Hanari freighter had cleared the approach and was moving toward docking alignment. Another vessel, viral this time, adjusted its path in response. Smooth, predictable, equal. That will continue to change interaction models, he said. It already has. He inclined his head slightly. That was another difference. The new system did not require anyone to concede, only to operate within it. We stood in silence for a while. Not uncomfortable, just present. Below, the traffic continued. Ships entering, exiting, adjusting, following a system that no longer prioritized one over another. The real shift was not who held authority. It was how authority functioned. It had moved from individuals to structure, from influence to process, from control to consistency. And once that kind of system takes hold, it doesn't announce itself. It simply becomes the way things are done. Footsteps approached from behind. Light. Measured. I didn't turn immediately. I already knew who it was. Prelith stopped beside me, then stepped forward into my line of sight. She had changed, not in any visible, physical way. In posture, in presence, less hesitation, more certainty. She held a tablet in one hand, but it wasn't what had brought her here. I've been assigned full liaison authority between the assembly and the outer systems, she said. Her voice carried the same careful precision it always had, but there was something new underneath it. Ownership. That's a significant responsibility, I said. Yes. A brief pause. I accepted it. I expected you would. She looked out at the traffic for a moment, following the movement, understanding it, not as an observer, as part of it. When I asked you in the corridor, she said, whether it was permanent, I remembered. We had been moving through the station at pace, the delegation behind us. Everything still uncertain in the way that the first minutes after a major decision always are. Charged and irreversible and impossible to fully feel until much later. I didn't answer you, I said. You said it was what it needed to be. That was true. She nodded slightly. I think I understand now. I turned then, just enough to meet her gaze. What do you understand? That permanence isn't decided in a moment. She gestured lightly toward the viewport. It's decided here, and in every place where the system is followed, or isn't. She looked back at the traffic. At first, I thought what happened in the chamber was the important part. It was necessary, I said, but not the important part. No. Her voice was quiet. Certain. This is the ordinary, the repetition, the absence of friction where friction used to exist. I followed her gaze. A breath vessel entered the pattern. Adjusted. Aligned. No hesitation. No assumption of priority. Just compliance. Not forced. Not negotiated. Expected. That's the difference, she said. Before, everything depended on who was watching, who was deciding, who had influence. And now it depends on the system, and the people who choose to follow it. That was the part most people missed. Systems don't enforce themselves. They are maintained, continuously, by every participant, in every action. I rested my hand lightly against the glass, felt the faint vibration of the station's systems beneath it. Steady, consistent, working. We didn't build something permanent, I said. We built something that can be. She considered that, then nodded. That's better. Yes. Because permanence, in the way most people think of it, doesn't actually exist. Structures change. Power shifts. Time moves forward whether you're ready for it or not. But frameworks can persist. If enough people decide they're worth maintaining. If enough people choose, repeatedly, to operate within them. Not because they are forced to, because they work. A notification appeared on Prelith's tablet. She glanced at it. Assembly review session in 20 minutes. You should be there. She hesitated for a moment. Then, thank you. For what? For not answering the question then. Her voice carried something that wasn't quite a smile, but lived in the same place. If you had answered it, I would have treated it like a conclusion. And now I understand it's a process. She inclined her head, not formally, not procedurally, personally. Then she turned and walked back down the corridor, already moving toward the next task, the next decision, the next small action that would either reinforce the system or weaken it. I watched her go for a moment, then turned back to the viewport. The traffic continued, uninterrupted, unremarkable, exactly as it should be. 6 months earlier, we had walked away from a system that no longer worked for us. We had not destroyed it. We had not replaced it. We had built something alongside it, something that could stand on its own, and when the time came, we had stepped into it. Not as participants waiting to be recognized, as equals. That had been the moment. But moments pass. What remains, what actually matters, is what you do inside the ordinary days. The days with no drama and no decision point and no chamber to walk out of. The days where the only choice is whether to hold the line of a framework that someone, somewhere, decided was worth building. That was where permanence lived, not in the decision, in everything that came after it. I let my hand fall from the glass and turned toward the corridor. There was still work to do. There would always be work to do. And for the first time since we had entered that chamber 3 years, 4 months, and 9 days ago, it was work we were doing entirely on our own terms.